What is your current assessment of the global economy and financial markets?
The government is going to have to spend more and more year after year, and they're just going to borrow the money. So deficit is going to grow. At the same time, interest rates are higher, which means all of our government debt has to be rolled over at higher and higher rates, which means higher and higher interest expense. So you put those two things together, and we're going to be adding a couple of $1 trillion a year to the debt. And it's going to be kind of a death spiral where we pay more and more interest on the debt that we're taking on, which leads us to take on even more debt. And it's not clear how we get out of that. That is something that could basically end the financial system as we know it.
You wrote a book, John, called The Money Bubble. How material is this shifting into reverse right now in terms of the growth of M2?
It's potentially huge because so much leverage has been built up in so many different sectors of the global economy because money was so easy for such a long time. In other words, we were flooding the system with new cash and new credit year after year after year. And that made a lot of things possible that probably shouldn't have been possible. You look at SPACs and NFTs and most of the rest of the crypto space and big tech and government bonds. How did Italy take on the amount of debt that it took on? Only because there was so much money sloshing around in the global financial system. So all those guys and many, many other over-leveraged financial entities out there can only survive if new money is handed to them year after year after year. And that's changed now. All of a sudden, the amount of money in the system is shrinking. As Warren Buffett says, it's only when the tide goes out that you find out who's been swimming naked. Well, the everything bubble, or the money bubble, as James Turk and I titled our book, that's a place where thousands and thousands, if not millions, of financial entities have been swimming naked. In other words, they can't function without tons of new money coming in. And they're going to be exposed as bad business models, as frauds, as all kinds of things that lead to bankruptcy in the next few years. So we're going to see all kinds of banks, hedge funds, and potentially governments implode because there isn't enough money to keep them going.
The numbers have doubled, or in the case of debt, the debt pile actually, I think, is more like tripled. I'm doing this from memory now, but I think in the US at least, federal debt was like around 9 trillion. In 2008, it's now 31 trillion.
Whatever we do, whatever the central banks and the governments of the world do, they risk a gigantic crisis of one kind or another. And so it's just a question of choosing now. They got to, make their choices, decide which crisis they're going to risk, and then go for it. And so far, they're tightening. They're risking the deflationary depression risk. Another year like last year in terms of monetary tightening, we could be there. That it could happen.
All right. And the reason why I'm sort of diving into this is because the debt part of the story is such an important one. And real quick, I want to dial into some charts around, the stats around the way things are with debt and then with the rising interest payments on the debt. But real quick, can you just make the link for us between money, especially fiat currency, and debt? So we have a debt-based money system in most major, well, probably I think in all, world economies these days. For the viewer that doesn't exactly understand that the way that somebody as experienced as you do, John, can you just give the 60-second description of what that means?
Well, in a fiat currency fractional reserve banking system, credit can be created in basically unlimited quantities by the banking system as long as the government helps by creating a lot of new currency and giving it to the big bank. In good times, when there's a steady stream of new money coming into the system, it becomes kind of a Ponzi scheme where you can create unlimited amounts of credit and get away with it. And that's what we've seen really since the 1990s, when the Federal Reserve started bailing out everybody in sight and basically telling the banking system, go ahead and take any risk you want. We've got your back. So we've seen the creation of amounts of credit that are totally unprecedented in human history. We've never seen debt grow like this before.
They want to wait and see what happens and then basically call an audible later on in the year. That's path number one. Path number two is that something breaks. And it forces the Fed to have to ease just because there's some major crisis that it just can't ignore, right? Maybe a freezing up in the credit markets or banks start failing or whatever it is, right? But there's a lot of people that think that that's probably what's going to happen here. Then there's more of what you were saying earlier, John, about like if we continue strengthening the dollar here at this point in time, it could really start killing a lot of our allies who are getting crushed under a strong dollar policy. But also, just as we talked about earlier, just the interest service cost just gets so dang high for us that we just might not be able to sustain that. So do you have a sense of which of those three you think is more likely here?
At a certain point, they're all the same scenario. The Fed feels obligated to raise interest rates because, we had 8% official inflation in the US last year. That is catastrophic from the point of view of a central bank with a 2% inflation target. The Fed has to raise interest rates to the point that it breaks something. So that's what they'll do. I mean, they will stay tight until the economy shows signs of inflation ending. And for that to happen, you got to have a downturn. And for there to be a downturn, some of these over-leveraged entities have to blow up. So the Fed will raise interest rates or at least keep them high and stable until something breaks.
I was going to ask you to compare what you think could happen here to the pain of the 2008 global financial crisis. But it seems pretty clear from some of the stuff you're talking about that it may feel a hell of a lot worse than 2008 did.
Yeah, because we were able to bail out the banks last time around because there was no real official inflation to speak of. And debt levels were high, but not crazy high. It was possible for the US to toss trillions of dollars at bankrupt financial entities and bail them out. It's not clear that we have that ability now. So if we can't do that now, I think that we'll try and we'll fail. That's what will make the coming crisis so much different from 2008, 2009.
Now, this assumes that the whole world monetary order doesn't break, this year. But if it doesn't, it looks like the order that we have lived with is still going to be fracturing in really important ways that could be relatively injurious to the comfort and the status quo that the West has become accustomed to.
The petrodollar is going to get some competition in the year ahead. Part of that is that it's inevitable that other countries, as they develop, are going to be better at things than they were. But a big part of this is because the US has just totally abused its privilege. I mean, we have the world's reserve currency. And instead of making that a neutral currency that everybody can use without making any kind of a political statement or feeling disadvantaged or whatever, we use it as a weapon. And rising powers like Russia and China and India are really offended by that. And it's logical that they want to build an alternative to the dollar for certain kinds of trade.